What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. I'm going to continue my conversation with you concerning the complete history of boxing. I'm going to turn this conversation into the direction where it should have began, and that's bare knuckle. Bare knuckle symbolizes a great deal, and we'll go over what it truly means. In order for two men to cope with one another, there has to be some boundaries. There has to be a set of rules. There has to be respect and honor. And if those requests, if you will, are not honored, then there's a set of tools that have to be used in order to keep things in order. And the most common tools that a man would have is his two fists. Now, from the beginning of man until his current state, the basic tools that these men would always have would be their two fists. And they were always utilized for control, for power, for direction, to solve their grievances. Whether it's the mighty pen, the usage of control, or to use fists in a direction that would harm the other party. So let's talk about how these fists were used and who were the first to use it, and each era how those fists were developed. What rules and regulations would allow those fists to control, to be utilized? What champions came out of those eras with the usage of their fist? The first man we're going to talk about comes from the first country that would produce the sport that would allow fists to be utilized, the game of pugilism, and that would be Great Britain. England's first champion was Jim Figs. He was champion from 1719 to 1730. He would lose one fight. But why is it important to name James Figs as the first fighter, whether he was champion or not? Because James Figs would be a swordsman. And that would be the first time that a tool to solve grievances would be transcribed into the thought process of what a man felt and how he felt the grievances should be resolved. From that point, he would begin to use his fist. And he was pretty good at it, losing one match. But then he would retire. Not before he had a protege named Jack Brockton. He became champion in 1740. Jack Broxton was very important to the game of pugilism because he came up with the 7 rules of boxing. Before those rules were implemented, there were no rules. No rules of any significance. Man could bite a man. He can take his thumb and press it on the throat of a fighter who was laying down on the ground helpless. He can knee. He can kick a man in the head while he was down. He can fall on a man elbow first, to the nose, to the skull. He can kick a man in the nuts. He could basically do whatever he wanted to the man once he had him in a comatose state. There were too many ring deaths. And Jack Brockton killed a man. And that caused him to decide that it was savage, and some structure had to take place. So he would come up with the 7 rules of boxing. But after Jack Brockton, you had Jack Slack, 1750. Jack Slack would be the mentor of the first American fighter. That first American fighter would become the first American trainer. That American trainer would be the first trainer of America to be in the corner of a championship fight. That man's name is Bill Richmond. Bill Richmond would be the first American fighter. He would be the first American trainer. He would train the first American fighter to fight for a championship. And that first American fighter was the second American fighter to fight overseas. His name was Tom Molyneux. Tom Molyneux would challenge Tom Cribb in 1810. That would be an American fighter's first opportunity to fight for a title. Both Tom Molyneux and Bill Richmond were black fighters. And they would be the first fighters of America. Very important. So you had cultural rivalries now, where you had a black fighter fighting a white fighter from 2 different countries. Had Tom Molyneux been treated fairly and he became the champion, he would be the first fighter of America to win a title. He would have been the first fighter of America who was black. And he would have changed the game, if you will. Tom Molyneux was more of an MMA fighter than he was a 2-fisted puncher. He would learn that in very short times with Bill Richmond, because Bill Richmond learned from Jack Slack. And Tom Molyneux would face Tom Cribb 2 separate occasions. In their first fight, it went 33 rounds. Bill Richmond was in the corner of Tom Molyneux. As I stated, he was the first trainer of America. He trained Tom Molyneux. And Bill Richmond figured, because he had somewhat of a reputation before Tom Molyneux came over from America to England, and he thought he would get fair play. Tom Cribb had 7 men in his corner. And when Tom Molyneux would knock down and cause a comatose state of Tom Cribb, those 7 men in Tom Cribb's corner would jump into the ring, and it would knock down Tom Molyneux, stomping on his hands, and sprinkle down some metal pellets, and then complaints stating that Tom Molyneux was using unfair labor practice by bringing pellets in the ring, iron pellets. Tom Molyneux had his fist clenched because his hand was broken after being stomped. So they used that tactic of trying to frame him, stating that he had a fist full of pellets. Well, Tom Molyneux was hit in the back of the head with an iron pipe. He was dizzy, he was down, and it would give Tom Cribb time to recover. Now, I mentioned to you before that Tom Molyneux was really an MMA fighter, and he was used to body slamming. He was the best that you had. I think he was the inventor, really, of the DDT. But he couldn't use those tactics, and Tom Molyneux would eventually recover. But he wasn't strong enough at that point to deal with Tom Cribb, who had the experience, who was fully recovered. Tom Molyneux was slightly recovered. So he would wind up losing the match. Had that not happened and he was treated fairly, he would have been the first American fighter to win a title. A first American fighter to win a title overseas, and the first American black fighter to become champion. It would not have become George Dixon as the first black fighter to win a title overseas. It would have been Tom Barlow. Now, it's important we understand those steps. We have to know where boxing came from in a sense of what happened in the game, what dirty tactics happen in the game, what's being brought to the forefront. You would have Jim Ward in 1825, James Deaf Berkey in 1833. You had Nathan Latham in 1853, Tom Sawyer, 1857, Jim Mace, in 1861. Now, Jim Mace was a very interesting fighter. He fought for the title several times. In fact, February 7th, 1890, he would be in the ring with Charlie Mitchell, and he would be stopped in 3 rounds in Edinburgh, Scotland. Charlie Mitchell would face John L. Sullivan, and that would be considered the first American championship fight. Now, July 27th, 1891, Ken Pritchard would knock out Jim Smith. Knocked him out in 3 rounds in London, England. Why that was significant? Because Jim Smith would eventually take on Jake Kilrain in 1887, and that would be for the Police Gazette belt. Jim Smith was England's champion. Jake Kilrain was America's champion. John O'Sullivan was the America's bare knuckle champion. And John O'Sullivan would really set the stage. He would walk around Boston stating he was the best fighter. He would lick any son of a bitch in the house. And that happened in 1889 when John O'Sullivan would take on Jake Kilrain. And that bout would last over 7 hours plus. Both men would crawl back to their corners, vomiting on the way. The skin would be scraped off their metacarpals. They were both unrecognizable of their wives. Their heads were the size of a watermelon. They had to light candles to continue the match because it lasted 7 hours into nightfall. As we continue the conversation with the history of British championship fighters, we look at men such as Jim Smith. He would knock out Ken Pritchard. He would knock out Dick Birch. As I stated, he would be in a ring with Jake Kilrain. He would take on fighters such as Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler, and we talked about him several times. February 19th, 1897, George Cripp would knock out Jim Smith in 5 rounds. All this took place in England. Gunnar Moyer would win a disqualification over Jack Palmer in London, England. That happened October 29th, 1906, the same year that Tommy Burns of Canada would take over the heavyweight championship reign in America. At that time, in 1905, the Boilermaker Jim Jeffries would retire from the ring. Now, John O'Sullivan will win his America's Bare Knuckle Championship title in 1882 when he would defeat Paddy Ryan. Paddy Ryan would defeat Joe Gauss. Joe Gauss, as we talked about, and we'll continue to talk about Joe Gauss, this is the passing of the baton of the way boxing would change itself. You wouldn't have any more eye gouging at this point. But January 27th, 1896, Dan Creedon would knock out Jim Smith in 2 rounds in London, England. Dan Creedon would have 2 very exciting fights with Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler of America. I talked about Frank Craig. Frank Craig was some fighter. He would be very strategic in his approach. He would take on Joe Butler of Philadelphia. And that was a rivalry. I gave some contents of that contest. November 7th of 1910, you had Iron Hugh. He knocked out Colt Brown and Sheffield in England. You had the Bombardier Billy Wells, knocks out Iron Hughes and Packy McHawley, Pat O'Keefe. You had Joe Beckett. He knocks out Bombardier Billy Wells. February 27th of 1919. That's in England, but in America, 1919 meant the America's Expeditionary Forces. When you had Gene Tunney, you had Leo Patterson, you had Kaiser and Bob Martin. 1919 also produced a new heavyweight champion. And his name was Jack Dempsey, the Manasseh Mola. He would knock out Jess Willard in Toledo, Ohio. That was one of the most brutal heavyweight championship contests with gloves in all of boxing. When John O'Sullivan and James J. Corbett, who by the way was a bank teller, would exchange gloves in 1892 in the Carnival of Champions, September 7th to be exact. That was the first time a heavyweight championship contest took place with gloves. 5-ounce gloves were introduced in a heavyweight championship contest. So now you had gloves that were very instrumental in protecting the hands, but the gloves really signified the direction that boxing would be moving into until its current state. Different sizes, different types, different material within the gloves. England would still be bare knuckle for a short time. But then you would have fighters such as Tommy Farr, Jack Peterson, Reggie Mean. They would fight the fighters such as Charlie Smith and Reggie Mean, Lynn Harvey, Jack McAvoy. You had fighters such as Bruce Woodcott, Jack London, Jack Gardner, Don Cockell, Brian London, Joe Erkenstein, you had Henry Cooper. In the light heavyweight division, you had Freddie Mills, Freddie Mills would take the title from Anton Christopheridis. And Joey Maxson would take the title away from Freddie Mills. Now, Freddie Mills took on a black murderers row fighter, Lloyd Marshall, and he was knocked out pretty good. Freddie Mills would be alleged to be involved in some killings, which I think he was set up. It was said that he committed suicide. I believe he was murdered. Freddie Mills was a very, very good boxer. And he was a good representation for England, because I have some of his books that he came out with on how to fight. But Henry Cooper would be the last man to come through the stages of boxing in Europe, where he fought Cassius Clay, and he would take on Joe Butler and Joe Erkenstein. He took on Dirk Richmond and Brian London. Henry Cooper was something else. So when we look at bare knuckle, when we look at boxing and different stages of it, you must keep in mind it has a history. It has conversation within its own history. The American bare knuckle champions, 1816. First man would be Jacob Heyer. He would defeat Tom Beasley. Jacob Heyer had a son named Tom Heyer. When Jacob Heyer defeated Tom Beasley, he would become the champion and hold that title for 25 years. The next time that title was enforced was in 1841. And Tom Heyer, who was the son of Jacob Heyer, would now take over that title. And he would be the claimant of his father's laurels. He was 22 years old. He weighed 205 pounds. He stood 6 foot 2.5 inches. And he took on a fighter, John McCusker. And from that point, Heyer would meet Yankee Sullivan. Yankee Sullivan was another fighter when you look at boxing from its historic point. Had some meaning behind it. John C. Morris would claim the America's championship. He defeated Yankee Sullivan October 12, 1853, in 37 rounds. But then you would have Morris fight John C. Heenan at Long Point, Canada. He would break his right hand. This happened in 1858. The International Bare Knuckle Champions took place in 1869 when you had Tom Allen. And he would face a fighter named McCool, June 15th of that year, 1869. Now in 1871, Jim Mace would take on Joe Corborn. Joe Corborn, who returned from his retirement and fought twice without any results. And then you will have Joe Gauss in 1876. He would meet Joe Mace in England. 1880, June 21st to be exact, Paddy Ryan would face Joe Gauss. And he would knock him out. He would be the America's bare knuckle champion. But in 1882, Paddy Ryan would take on John O'Sullivan, February 7th to be exact. And he would be knocked out by John O'Sullivan in 9 rounds. The contest took place in Mississippi. And John O'Sullivan would become the last bare knuckle American champion. Because in 1892, he would lose his laurels when he took on Jim Corbett. And Jim Corbett would knock out John O'Sullivan in 21 rounds. New Orleans. It would be the third day in the third bout of the Carnival of Champions. And from that point, you would have fighters such as Corbett. From Corbett, you would have Bob Fitzsimmons with the famous solar plexus punch in Carson City in 14 rounds. He would knock out Gentleman Jim Corbett. And from there, you would have the Boilermaker Jim Jeffries. He would retire. Tommy Burns would take on Marvin Hart. And then Tommy Burns would be knocked out in 14 rounds by the first American black fighter. And his name was Jack Johnson. And he would be stopped in 15 rounds. 26 rounds, in 1915 with Jess Willard. And Jess Willard would be knocked out. Couldn't answer the fourth round. With the Master Molar, Jack Dempsey, in 1919. 1926 in Philadelphia, Gene Tunney. And he would retain that title in 27, the famous long count in Soldiers Field in Chicago. He would retire. Then you would have fighters such as the Boston Gob, Jack Sharkey. He would face the Philly Phantom, Tommy Loughran, for the America's Heavyweight Championship title. Then he would lose his portion of that title to Germany's heavyweight champion, Max Schmeling, the Black Uhlin. 1932, Jack Sharkey would become the World Heavyweight Champion. Then he would be stopped by Primo Carnera. And then Max Baer, and James Braddock, and then the second Black American heavyweight champion, Joe Louis. From 1937 to 1949. Then you would have for the first time 2 black fighters who would eventually become champion, Ezzard Charles and Joe Walcott. Both men would become champion. But then you would take on fighters like the Brockton blockbuster, Rocky Marciano. He would retire. Floyd Patterson, Sonny Liston, Patterson again, and Ingemar Johansson. Floyd Patterson. And then you would have Sonny Liston, and then Sonny Liston would give him a rematch. Then Cassius Clay, Joe Frazier, and Foreman, and on and on to Mike Tyson's and Larry Holmes and Greg Page's and Michael Dokes, Pinklin Thomas, Michael Spinks, Mike Weaver, Lennox Lewis, and then you would have Anthony Joshua's and Deontay Wilder's, Tyson Fury's. Boxing has a rich history, and I just wanted to have that conversation with you. I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. All great fights and all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. We will continue our conversation with the complete history of boxing. We'll get into lower weights and bare knuckle eras, how the belts were exchanged. We'll get into the colored championship divisions. Thanks for listening. Be well. Peace.